Hey everybody, happy Friday. Now, really quickly, just wanted to tell you that you're about to see part one of a series of 5 conversations that I had with Jared Turner. I'll introduce him in the conversation, but he's a wonderful guy and he's a massive enthusiast and proponent of extensive reading for language learning. He's just so knowledgeable about it. He's read so much academic literature and research. He talks to teachers and schools all over the place to help them understand how they might implement extensive reading programs at their schools for language learning. So it's just a great series of conversations. I think you're going to learn everything you need about extensive reading, including lots of references to research papers, but also lots of personal anecdotes from Jared and myself and our language learning. And also, just so you know, for supporters of my Patreon page, I always offer them the opportunity to ask their own questions to people who I interview. So this weekend, I'm going to be posting a special video on Patreon, which is separate from the 5 core conversations. And that's just where Jared and I go through and answer all the questions that people on the Patreon page asked. So of course, if you want to see that video or if you want the opportunity to ask your own questions to future people who I interview, then please go to patreon.com/Robin MacPherson. Without further ado, let's jump in. Have a wonderful Friday, and I hope you love the video. Hey everybody, happy Friday, welcome back, and this is a very, very special video because it's the first episode of an entire conversation series with Jared Turner. Jared Turner, everybody! What's up, Jared?
Hey, Robin, great to be here.
Great to have you here. So, in case any of you don't know, Jared is actually the co-founder of Mandarin Companion, which is a graded reader company that produces Mandarin Chinese graded reader materials. Now, I've been speaking about these quite a bit because I've been reading them for my Mandarin studies. And so, as the co-founder of a graded reader company, Jared has become fascinated by extensive reading, which is an amazing topic. It's a very large topic, and I have found that there's a really large appetite in the community for more information on this. And I'm trying to do a better job of balancing my own opinion and experiences with actual scientific research and just bringing other people in. And I think there's no better person to chat about this with than Jared. So that's what we're going to do. How you feeling, Jared?
I am feeling great. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Awesome. So the goal of this series, I think both of us have, is we want anyone in the audience to come away with basically all their questions about extensive reading answered, or we want to certainly do a pretty good job of that. We don't want anyone to just have these big massive questions. So that's the reason we're doing a whole series. And today we're going to be starting out with discussing, Jared, I want to know, how has extensive reading impacted your personal language learning story? Because we all start in the same place, right? We all want to learn a language, and at least those of us in this community. Otherwise, if you're learning gardening, probably the wrong place, but I recommend you stay. So we all start there, right? But you know, many of us get led in different directions and we become fascinated with certain aspects of language learning. And I'm particularly interested in how you ended up being so interested in extensive reading and how did it impact your language learning?
I first moved to Shanghai, China in about 2010. And when I moved over there, I didn't speak any Chinese, just up and moved to China. Our story of getting there is a little bit crazy, but without going too deep into that, I started casually learning Chinese just on my own. I had, when I first moved there, there was a guy I knew who really helped me a lot. His name was Von Wilhelm. He spoke some great Chinese, kind of mentored me, tutored me along a little bit. But I just practiced. I worked in a Chinese company as my first job there. And there was, I bet maybe 80 people. There were about 3 people who spoke decent English. And so, I studied in the morning. I went to work. But I was also still largely in like an English environment with my family. I was married with a couple kids. And so it slowly progressed over a while, but I just didn't really get super into learning Chinese. As a result, 2 years later, my Chinese was kind of like broken. It was like words and phrases. I wasn't really conversational per se. And it wasn't until this one point I was working with some Chinese investors and I was helping them start some educational programs in English. And as part of this program we were launching, I had interviewed this teacher from England. Hey, hey. But he was a career English teacher and had spent many years teaching around Asia. And during our interview, he was so excited to tell me about this method of language learning called extensive reading. And in fact, here's what really piqued my interest. He told me this story. He said that when he was there at the University of Bangkok, they actually did a test study on extensive reading. They took two groups of students. One group of students went through traditional TOEFL training, and the other group of students went through extensive reading. And they gave them both the TOEFL before and after the period of this class. And the students who went through the extensive reading course by far outperformed the students who just went through traditional TOEFL training. And, that caught my interest. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And so I went off and I just started reading everything I could about extensive reading. I found research papers. I jumped down the rabbit hole. I spent literally 3 months just reading everything I could. I got in touch with some of the experts in the field. Most of the research and extensive readings come out of Japan and Korea. That's where most of it is interesting. But think about English as a second language. Most of that activity is not happening in America. It's happening outside of primarily English-speaking countries. So, but Japan is even half of all Japanese universities now have extensive reading programs. So
fascinating. And so, were you actually practicing extensive reading during this period, or were you just taking a step back and just learning about extensive reading?
I was just learning about it. That's it. And because we are looking to potentially apply that towards English language education, but I eventually, when I got into this, I'm like, wait a second, if this is as good as it says it is, this should help me learn my Chinese. So I looked around and I found a series of graded readers in Chinese, and I read 10 books in a period of about 3 months. And during that time, and I'll preface this, Robin, that I was just reading on the subway to work every day. And it was roughly 25, 30 minutes. That's it.
Nice. That's dead time. Using your dead time.
So I was just reading on the subway. And I'm telling you, my first book was slow. I was still kind of looking up some characters here and there. I knew a lot of characters, but it was like I had all the puzzle pieces, but they were all kind of messy, scattered everywhere. And I didn't know how to put it together. But I started reading these books. And like I said, 10 books in 3 months. And my Chinese went from broken to conversational, really fast.
Wow.
And it was significant. It was like my coworkers were saying, Jared, what are you doing? What your Chinese is getting so much better. And I'm like, I'm just reading books. I felt like I was cheating on a test. It was just all kind of came together in my head. And,
right.
And after that, I read all the books that were in the series. And then I was like, wow, this is amazing. And make another long story short, we decided to, my wife was like, you should make your own. And I later on partnered up with John Pasden, who's now my partner with Mandarin Companion. And we started Mandarin Companion. And we have 16 books later. So here we are.
And I want to hit upon something there that you mentioned, which is the idea that through reading, your speaking skills, amongst others, I imagine, improve dramatically. And I think this is one of the big misconceptions around different methods of learning languages. I'm a huge proponent, for example, of writing, to learn a language. And as you know, I'm just about to launch Journaly, but I think writing is such a powerful way to not only improve your writing skills, to improve every other skill, your speaking, your comprehension, and so on, right? And so likewise, I think reading is an amazing tool for improving your speaking skills, but I think that very often people assume it's a one-to-one. If you want to improve your speaking, you should speak. If you want to improve reading, you should read. Not the case, right? And I think that in a way, some of the biggest magic is in those sort of cross sections where you find that, whoa, speaking suddenly just improved my reading improved my speaking skills dramatically. So can you tell me a bit more about what that experience was like to find that, wow, reading is improving my speaking so much that my coworkers are noticing, dramatically. And I also would love you to talk a little bit about what is the curve like? You know, is it just pretty linear, or does it start out really slow and then sort of pick up exponentially? Tell me everything.
Yeah, well, I think, for like, first off, people like kind of noticing your Chinese is getting better. Well, Chinese is a little bit unique in the respect and perhaps to other languages where, it's super easy for people to compliment you. You say ni hao in Chinese and, all the native Chinese are like, wow, your Chinese is so good. But, when you start actually getting traction in your language and you're able to start like effectively communicating, some of that kind of melts away a little bit, especially people you're familiar with. But it was very rewarding now to be able to start moving some conversations to Chinese. In my specific story, we were used to communicating in English in a number of respects, but I was able to do more things in Chinese. And simply, I'm telling you, when you actually read a book in your target language, I mean, it's the feeling's amazing. I remember when I finished my first book, I'm like, woo! I'm like, ready to do cartwheels down the middle of the subway train,
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I just finished Amor, which is one of the graded readers. I just made a video about it a couple of days ago, and it is a feeling that I wish every learner could and should experience. I think
That's amazing. Congratulations, Robin.
Thank you.
How did that feel?
It's incredible because there's just something so special about turning that last page. And it's just as you go through a story and you feel your reading speed start to increase, you start to build a relationship with the characters, and at a certain point, I think near the end of a short story like this, it's a cool feeling to realize you now have a relationship with the people in this book, right? You have a relationship with the story itself. You prefer certain characters, maybe you despise others. There's one in particular in this book that I was like, don't like that guy. And I would find myself having these emotional reactions reading the book, and when you realize this is in Mandarin Chinese, right? Or whatever language it is, that's special. And closing that last page, it's something else.
Wow. It's like a serious accomplishment, and there's a number of people who will say like, I never dreamed I would be able to read a book in Chinese. And there's something about like, I think reading a book in Chinese or a language like that, where that's more like pictographic, characters, because, it takes a lot more work to read as opposed to something that's like just phonetically based alphabet, and so I've had feedback from readers who had said like, I was ready to give up on Chinese. I never felt like I was making progress. And I never dreamed that I'd be able to read a book in Chinese. And now I read a book in Chinese. I read one of your Mandarin Companion graded readers, and wow, now I'm into this. My motivation's up. I feel like you can do something because, Chinese, it's one of those things you can study for years and years and feel like you still can't do much with your language. But being able to actually read something in Chinese, it's a big deal. And it makes a big impact on not just fluency development, because we'll talk all about that, right?
Yep.
Maybe in this video or in a future video, but we will. It's called the affect dimensions. There's dimensions of motivation, of how enjoyable the whole experience is, your motivation, that type of stuff. I mean, it makes a huge impact in those, aside from all of the cognitive development stuff that happens in your brain.
Yeah, I agree. And so, lastly, as we close this first conversation out, can you talk a little bit more about what's the curve like, right? It was a 3-month period, right? That was the initial. I'm sure it continued after that. How long did it take to start seeing a noticeable difference?
Well, honestly, I think for me it was after the first book. Now, everyone's mileage is going to vary, but because some people are going to be coming at it from a low level and working up. My experience was like I had all the pieces and the book just helped me put it together. All right. So what I noticed, like in my experience from reading that first book, reading my first chapter in a book, I mean, it took me like a half an hour. It was pretty slow, even though I knew a lot of the words. But by the end of the book, I mean, I was reading a chapter, I think in, like maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then from then on, it just kind of increases. And so I don't actually, it'd be interesting to go back and rate my time now. But, I can read a chapter in, in maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and where before it would took a lot longer. And so, I noticed a lot of a dramatic increase in that first reading speed. But then after you get into a few books, and we'll talk about this, but it's something about when you start seeing lots of natural language and context, you start to see the patterns, the grammar, you start seeing how different words are used, and your brain just starts to kind of understand it in Chinese. And so it positively impacts your speaking and listening and of course writing, just because the Chinese is starting to make sense in your head, or whatever target language it is.
I agree. Yeah, one thing I'll say in closing is that my experience reading this first graded reader in Chinese, but I've also had this experience with many other languages, is that when I first start learning a language, it's very much like a computer. It's like I just bought a little Mac book in my head for Chinese learning, and it's got all the worst specs. It's got crap memory, terrible performance, not a lot of power. And so I'm bringing in Mandarin Chinese in this example, and it's like I don't even have enough power to process a full sentence before the computer shuts down. I got to reboot it and start again. And then I get a bit further, and it feels like I just have limited resources, limited memory, that short-term memory. So by the time I get to the end of the sentence, I've already kind of forgotten what the start was. And as I go through, what I'm doing essentially, it feels like I'm just building those resources up. I'm adding RAM, I'm adding more memory, adding processing power, and it's like my ability to process language into comprehension becomes so much better, to the point where I can finally start to do it in one clean stream.
Yep.
And so my experience with reading Emma was that at the start of the book, I would read the same sentence 3 times over. I would read it, go back, and I had to keep reading it until I could process it, right? But by the end of the book, I still did that. I'm still doing it, but it's a lot less. There are more and more sentences where I can read the sentence and I can keep going. I can keep going again, and so that's great. And I think that impacts your listening comprehension tremendously, because then when you go speak to somebody, you've had that practice of bringing in language as input, processing it as comprehension, and then you can keep up. And same thing with speaking. I don't know. I love it. I love
it's great.
This.
There's a term for that. And then we call it automatic processing.
There we go.
It's where you just understand it in Chinese. I mean, essentially that's what you're talking about, is that you see at the very beginning, like as a native speakers, let's just say we're obviously native English speakers, but at the beginning we're listening some Chinese. We listen, we translate it in our head back into English to try to understand it. Then we think about a response, and then we're translating back into Chinese and trying to spit it out. And so when you get to that automatic processing stage, is that there's none of that translation going on.
Yeah.
It's just you understand it in Chinese, you understand it in Chinese, you formulate a response in Chinese, and then you open your mouth and speak in Chinese.
Excellent.
And so, but it takes enough input to get to that.
Right.
And it takes enough, not just input, but comprehensible input.
Right. And I'm always,
because if we don't have comprehensible input, we don't know what's going on. We can't comprehend it, even with translation.
Right. And one of the questions I get asked the most is, how do you stop translating in your head, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that I've given some other interesting, solutions in the past. Like, I find that talking to yourself is actually a really interesting way to sort of train yourself to sort of think in a foreign language, because I find that when you think, it's almost this little inside voice, and what you're actually doing effectively is talking to yourself. You're like, well, what should I say today in that meeting? But I think that there are many ways to do this, and I think that reading is an amazing way to build that automaticity.
And so one of the best ways to do that is read at an extensive level. And we're going to get into this, right? But just a preview on that is that it's reading at a high level of comprehension. Right. So the target's about 98% level comprehension. And when you read at that level, you're able to start reading fluidly without stopping. Your eyes start to, just start to kind of hop between the words and characters much more quickly. In Chinese, also, we have parsing of the language, which is a whole nother level that we don't really talk about a lot, but that's actually a whole nother skill too that your brain needs to get used to.
Yep.
But once you start building a reading speed and you're reading fluently at a comprehensible level, you stop having time to translate in your head. And that's actually one of the great that happened to me, is that that translating in your head becomes a habit. And once you start reading fast enough and being able to comprehend and read at fast enough pace, you don't have time to translate in your head, and it starts to break that habit.
Yeah.
And you start moving to understanding in the language. further building the automatic processing, which fills up your RAM, your brain, with more space to do other things like, maybe think about a response, maybe, analyze the plot or what's going on at a deeper level, think about other things. There's just a whole bunch more things that your brain can do.
And with that, that's a great segue into this key point here, which is not just the graded readers, it's not just the reading that Jake did, it's that it was extensive reading. And so in the next conversation, which is going to come out next Friday, you're going to hear all about, all right, what is this thing? What is extensive reading? Let's talk about it. We'll see you back here next Friday.